In this video, we're going to cover Spring REST exception handling. Remember our problem in the previous videos, right? We would pass over a bad student ID of 999, and then we get this ugly exception, right? So 500 internal server error. We found out what the root cause was. It was an index out of bounds. What we really want is this. We want to handle the exception and return the error as JSON. So we'd like to have a nice little JSON message comes back that has the details on the error or the exception. So we'd like to give the actual status code of 404, the actual error message, and then maybe a timestamp as far as when this given error occurred. And that's what we really want. And that's what we'll actually build out in this video. Alrighty, so let's kind of look at the big picture here. So we have this REST client, the REST service. We make a call for API students 999. That's the bad data. It makes it into our REST service, throws an exception, and then we like to actually handle for that exception. And then instead of that ugly HTML page, we'll send back the exception error message as JSON. Alrighty, so let's look at the actual development process here. So the first thing we're going to do is create a custom error response class. Then we'll actually create a custom exception class. Next, we'll go through and update our REST service to throw the exception if the student is not found. And then finally, we'll add an exception handler method using Spring's @exceptionHandler annotation. Starting with step one, we're going to create this custom error response class. So this class will actually be sent back to the client as JSON. We'll define this as a Java class or a POJO, and we'll just keep track of 3 fields here. We'll keep track of the status, the message, and the timestamp. And then Jackson will actually be responsible for converting this POJO over to JSON, going back to the client. Now, with this POJO here, you can define any custom fields that you want to track. Here, I'm just keeping it simple by having these 3 fields of status, message, and timestamp, but you can easily extend it and easily add your own custom fields because just a regular Java POJO. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at the coding here. So we'll have this student error response.java. We'll create this class. We'll define those 3 fields for status, message, and timestamp. And then from there, we simply create our constructors and also our getters and setters. And that's it. It's just a regular basic Java POJO or Java class here. And again, in the bottom right, you'll see the little JSON portion here. Jackson will actually convert this POJO over to the appropriate JSON when we send it back. And that's it for this example. Now, moving ahead to step 2 as far as creating our custom student exception. So this custom student exception will be used by our REST service. So in our code, if we can't find the student, then we'll actually throw this exception. So we need to define a custom student exception class. We'll actually call it student not found exception. All right, so let's go ahead and define our custom student exception. So our class extends runtime exception, and then we define a constructor here. And this constructor will basically make use of super, so just call the super class constructor for the message. And that's it. So since we're using inheritance, there's not much code we have to write here for this given exception. And this is a very common approach for creating exceptions. In step 3, we're going to update the REST service to throw an exception. So here's the basic coding here for our student REST controller. In the method for getStudent for a given student ID, we're going to check the student ID against the list size. So we check the student ID. If it's greater than or equal students.size, or the student ID is less than 0, then we're going to throw an exception, and we're going to throw a custom exception, student not found exception. And if we were using a database, we could easily check this against database results. Like we could do a query, see if we got any results. If we didn't get any results, then we could throw an exception accordingly. But here we're just keeping it simple by using the student ID to index into our array list. And if this if statement works out just fine, meaning that the student ID is within the range, then we simply return the students.get the student ID. And that's the happy path here. Now at this point, we have an exception that's thrown. So just kind of looking at our big picture again, our bad data coming in of 999. So we've thrown the exception, so that part is taken care of. But the next thing, or the missing link right now, is the exception handler. Who's going to handle the exception and how will they get the appropriate JSON data back to the client? So that takes us up to step 4 of adding the exception handler method. So what we're going to do here is define an exception handler method using this @exception handler annotation from Spring. This exception handler is going to return a response entity. The response entity is really just a wrapper for the HTTP response object. It gives you fine-grained control over specifying the actual status code, the actual HTTP headers, and also the body. So you have a bit more control over how you send back the response to the calling program. So we'll actually add the exception handler method here. So I'll kind of spec out the basic coding for it. So I'll make use of this annotation @exception handler. So we're saying, hey, this method that we're writing, it's an exception handler method. And then we also specify the type of the response body. So we have response entity, and we say in brackets, student error response. So that's the type of data we're going to pass back in the response body. And then we also tell it, hey, these are the types of exceptions that we can handle for this given handler method. So here I'll have student not found exception. So any student not found exceptions that are thrown, this actual handler method will catch it and then work on it accordingly. Alrighty, so we're inside of the method here. So we go ahead and create our student error response. That's that custom POJA that we created earlier. And then we simply set some fields here. So I set the actual status of http.status not found. So that's basically a 404. We set the actual error message based on the exception, exe.getMessage. And then we also set the timestamp in here. I just use a system.currentTime in millis to give us the current timestamp. So that's the basic piece here as far as creating that student error response and then loading it with the appropriate data. And then now what I do is actually move through and return the appropriate response entity here. So I say return new response entity, and then I give error, comma, the status code. So the actual first argument here, that's the actual body. So error, that's that custom student error response that we've just created. And then we give HTTP status dot not found. That's the 404 error that will return to the calling program. And then Jackson will be responsible for converting the actual body to the appropriate JSON. And so we'll get this JSON going back to the calling program. And so that's the basic layout there as far as the coding. All right, so let's kind of just do a recap and kind of pull it all together. We covered a lot of steps there, a lot of moving parts. So nice big picture here. So we're passing over a request, sending over bad data, makes it into the service. We saw the code there for throwing the exception. And then we also added code in there to handle the exception. And then that exception handler is going to pass back that response, our custom response here, and send back the JSON accordingly to the calling program. So we get our desired output here, the error going back as JSON and not that scary HTML page.